Richard Allen has been called freedom's prophet, the apostle of freedom, and a black founding father. He was born as a slave in a colonial American world, and Allen would grow up to do some incredible things. He was a founder and pastor of Bethel Church in South Philadelphia. He was the organizer of the Free African Society, which was the first black reform society in America. He is probably most known for being the founder of the African Methodist Episcopal Church. Furthermore, he was the first black bishop in the United States and perhaps even in the world. He was a preacher, an author, an abolitionist, and a conductor on the Underground Railroad, and he lived an incredible life. Honestly, I think we could spend hours just listing all of his accomplishments. He did more in one lifetime than most people do in 10 lifetimes. This episode, in my opinion, is incredibly timely. Richard Allen expresses some of the racial injustice we have continued to see so much of here recently in our nation, but Allen also lived through the yellow fever pandemic, which speaks to where we are currently in our world today. So join me on this episode of the Methodical Methodist Podcast as we explore the life and ministry of Bishop Richard Allen. Hello and welcome to the Methodical Methodist Podcast, a podcast where we talk about why the church is still relevant for us today as we explore themes connected to religion, politics, pop culture, faith, and yes, even the church. Together we can find out what it means to live into the mission of the church by making disciples. Now, let's get methodical. Hello everyone, I am your host, the Reverend Andrew Lay, and I'm excited to spend this time on the podcast today. If you like the show, I hope that you might take a minute to subscribe, rate, and write a review for the podcast. It helps to boost the show and make it to where more people can find it. You can also find me on Facebook at facebook.com/methodicalpod, and you can find me on Instagram as well at methodicalpod. So be sure to check me out. Richard Allen was born on February the 14th, 1760, at 2 o'clock in the morning. This birth occurred just a few weeks after a comet had flown across the sky. It's as if this comet had marked this special occasion. One biographer points to Isaiah 62:1 in denoting this special birth. Allen, who would be a prophet in his own right, certainly lives up to these words. For Zion's sake, I will not hold my peace, and for Jerusalem's sake, I will not rest, until the righteousness thereof go forth as brightness, and the salvation thereof as a lamp that burneth. Allen was born in Philadelphia as an enslaved child to a woman who was owned by a wealthy local attorney named Benjamin Chew. He was merely referred to as Negro Richard. After his birth, he, along with his mother, father, and 3 siblings, were moved to Chew's second property in Delaware. He apparently had 3 properties in all, and in his own autobiography, Allen says very little about growing up as a slave. But it is clear that even after he had been freed from slavery, he never forgot how horrible slavery had been. At the end of his life, he famously wrote, "Slavery is a bitter pill." Around 1768, when Allen was about 7 or 8 years old, he and his family were sold to one of Benjamin Chew's Delaware neighbors, a farmer named Stokely Sturgis. Allen spent over a decade working the land on Sturgis's farm, and during that time Sturgis sold his mother and 3 of his siblings to cover his debts. 3 of his siblings remained there with Allen at Sturgis's farm. Allen was able to visit his mother from time to time, but not very often. And it's just kind of heartbreaking to hear about a 7-year-old being separated from his mother and some of his siblings. And as a young child, he was forced to work all day in the fields. All he had ever known was slavery. Allen wrote about his experience as a slave, saying, "When we would think that our day's work was never done, we often thought that after our master's death, we were liable to be sold to the highest bidder, as Sturgis was much in debt, and thus my troubles were increased, and I was often brought to weep between the porch and the altar." Richard Allen clearly experienced this feeling of hopelessness that he might never find freedom. But as we will see, Allen was able to become a free man. It all started when the woods near Sturgis's farm had been cleared. And this clearing provided space for an itinerant, a traveling Methodist minister, to come spreading the gospel to a group of slaves. And Richard Allen was among that group. In 1777, at the age of 17, he was born again after hearing a revival sermon that was preached by this white itinerant Methodist preacher. Allen spoke about his conversion, saying, "I was awakened and brought to see myself poor, wretched, and undone, and without the mercy of God must be lost. One night I thought hell would be my portion. I cried to the Lord both day and night. I cried unto him who delighted to hear the prayers of a poor sinner. All of a sudden my dungeon shook, my chains flew off, and glory to God, I cried." Allen quickly joined this new Methodist society that continued to meet in the woods near Sturgis's farm. And this was a very foundational moment in his life. For the most part, Allen found support among the Methodist societies. Although American Methodism would eventually split north and south over the issue of slavery, in Allen's day, Methodists were outspoken with their anti-slavery comments. John Wesley, the founder of the Methodist movement, had offered his declaration against slavery in his tract, Thoughts Upon Slavery. Unfortunately, over time, Methodists forgot their original stance against the sin of slavery. In his own life, however, Richard Allen found that Methodism allowed him to become an anti-slavery spokesman. During this time, most Methodist ministers were openly against slavery. The church also recruited black people, both slave and free, to engage in organizational duties and even preach. Folks like Richard Allen, but also John Jay, Absalom Jones, Boston King, John Merritt, George White, and Peter Williams were able to stand up in Methodist pulpits and preach against the evils of slavery. Believe it or not, it wasn't unusual for a black slave to preach in front of white slave owners in a Methodist church. Over time, Allen attended Methodist meetings, and he slowly convinced his master, Sturgis, to allow some of these meetings to occur in and around Sturgis's home. And that is exactly what happened during the summer of 1779. In fact, Francis Asbury, one of the first bishops of the Methodist Church, even visited and preached at Sturgis's home. Then, in September 1779, a preacher named Freeborn Garretson, who had freed his own slaves in 1775, lectured Sturgis about being a slave owner, and this is what he said: "Thou art weighed in the balance and found wanting." After that experience, Sturgis could no longer justify being a slave owner. Allen said that after his encounter with Garretson, Sturgis could no longer be satisfied to hold slaves. So by January 25th, 1780, at the age of 20 years old, Allen had come to an agreement with his master. He would pay $2,000 over the span of 5 years in order to buy his freedom. And $2,000 is roughly the equivalent of about $37,500 today. So that's just, I think, an incredibly large amount of money. So I don't want to make Sturgis seem like the hero in this story. I don't really want him to seem like the white savior here, because even though Sturgis knew that slavery was morally wrong, he still required Allen to buy his own freedom, a freedom that should have been granted to him in the first place. So I wish that story happened differently, but we do see this shift occur in Sturgis's life enough so that he makes this way forward, this path, to be able to open freedom up for Richard Allen, even if he does have to pay for it. So from that moment on, after that agreement, Allen worked constantly. He took every odd job, he saved every penny, he did every bit of work he could in order to buy his freedom as soon as possible. He was afraid that Sturgis in his old age might die before he could reach that sum of money and buy his own freedom. And if that were to be the case, he would have just been auctioned off to another slave owner. So Allen was very, very motivated to try to reach that sum of money and save up that money in order to purchase his own freedom. And that's what he did. He was able to purchase his freedom a year and a half early. That's how hard he worked. He purchased his freedom a year and a half early. And so he signed his contract with Stokely Sturgis in 1780, and he paid that last installment in August 1783. And at the age of 23, Allen walked away from that farm with his freedom. One of the first things that he did with his newfound independence was choose a new name, something that was pretty common among slaves who had been freed. Up until this point, he had only been referred to as Negro Richard. But with his new freedom, Richard was able to pick out a last name, Allen. So with a new name and a new start, Richard Allen set off on the Methodist preaching circuit. Allen was qualified as a preacher in 1784 at the Christmas Conference in Baltimore, Maryland, and it didn't take long for the newly itinerant Allen to become a familiar figure at camp meetings and revivals. Just at the sound of Allen's voice saying something like, "Glory be to God," or "Come unto me, all ye that are weary and heavy laden," people would reply saying, "I have never heard such preaching before." Because of his incredible preaching skills, Allen became such a big name in Methodism that Pennsylvania abolitionists used his story as a model for others. They pointed out his extensive religious journeys that even extended to him preaching to Native Americans over the span of 2 months. After only 4 years of freedom, Richard Allen was known on both sides of the Atlantic, here in America and over in Britain. Despite times of illness, Richard continued to travel and preach. He preached in circuits in Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Delaware. In his autobiography, Allen named 24 people that he stayed with, prayed with, and preached with. In fact, the majority of his contacts at that time were white people. But Allen knew that there were limits to where he could go, where he could preach, and what he could and could not do. At one point, Bishop Francis Asbury asked Richard Allen to travel abroad with him and visit slavery's heartland, Maryland, Virginia, North and South Carolina. Asbury warned him, though, that he would not be allowed to intermix with slaves and he would have to sleep in his carriage at night. And Allen firmly replied, "I will not travel under those conditions. If I was to be taken sick, who would support me?" Asbury didn't really seem to understand Allen's concerns, and he replies that he would provide him adequate food and clothing. But Allen was speaking to a deeper-rooted situation. He knew that if he traveled to the Deep South, he would never be treated as a free man, and he knew that if he was to become sick and unable to travel, he would be left to the kindness of strangers and locals who more than likely disagreed with black equality and abolitionism. So he was unwilling to go there. He was unwilling to go down to the South and risk his freedom in that way. And so he told Asbury no and refused to travel with him, and he headed north instead. Despite Asbury's failure to truly understand what black people, and Allen in particular, were up against, these two Methodist itinerant ministers formed a very, very close relationship. An interracial friendship in the late 18th century in America was pretty uncommon, but in 1803, Allen celebrated his 2 decades of friendship by purchasing a horse for Asbury. It cost him $90, which was a pretty substantial amount of money back then. But these two men had been through some pretty foundational experiences together by this point. After all, when Allen had only been free for just a short time, it was Asbury who called on him by his full name in a crowd and asked Allen to help him save souls. When Allen broke away from white Methodists at St. George's in the 1790s, it was Asbury who gave the inaugural address to the new black church. And it was Asbury who had ordained Allen as the first black Methodist deacon in 1799. At the age of 26, Allen traveled to Philadelphia and began preaching to the black community at St. George's Methodist Episcopal Church in Philadelphia. but he was restricted to early morning services. He would hold services at 5 a.m., and a white pastor preached there later as well. And believe it or not, attendance quickly soared at this early service, so much so that there were more people from the black community than there were from the white community. And as Allen wrote, I soon saw a large field open in seeking and instructing my African brethren. By this time, Philadelphia had changed drastically. It was once a place where nearly 90% of black people were slaves, but by 1790, the overwhelming majority of the city of brotherly love had become free and was considered the capital of free black life. Allen not only preached in Philadelphia, he also worked closely with the Philadelphia Abolitionist Society. Richard Allen really had an extremely good work ethic. When he wasn't preaching or advocating for anti-slavery, he was laboring as a whitewasher, dry goods dealer, cobbler, and even formed his own chimney sweeping business, which became very, very successful. Although Philadelphia was changing, Allen saw that there were still many challenges that black people were facing. He realized that many white preachers had long forgotten the black community. And so in order to try and fill this gap, Allen would preach up to 5 times a day, in St. George's, on street corners, and really wherever he could even find a place. Within a year, Allen went from 5 members to 42 members at St. George's. By 1787, Allen had really started to turn his thoughts toward finding a place of worship for the black community. He wanted to even build, as he called it, an independent African church. But Allen and his fellow colleagues, Absalom Jones, William White, and Darius Grinning, were met with a lot of opposition from the white leaders at St. George's. In fact, Allen very vividly remembered later that they were lectured, harangued, and they even used very degrading and insulting language toward them. Still, Allen bided his time and continued to work toward this goal. White leaders instructed him to conduct services in a sober, deferential, and quiet way. Still, although he only whispered about this idea of forming this independent church, he continued working toward that goal. Also in 1787, Allen, along with 7 other men, came together to form the Free African Society. This society provided financial support to member families, and it epitomized black independence in the post-revolutionary period. It was a benevolent community organization as well as a lobbying group, and it quickly became a model for black communities around the country. All of this finally led to what many scholars have called a black exodus from a segregated white church. It started when, in the early 1790s, Allen and the other black members of St. George's found that they could not sit in their normal pews, and they were asked to sit in the balcony instead. Allen writes about this experience saying, "A number of us usually attended St. George's Church, and when the colored people began to get numerous in attending the church, they moved us from the seats we usually sat on and placed us around the wall. Then they were told that they must sit in the segregated balcony. On one Sunday, the balcony was full, and Allen and his friend Absalom Jones just sat in the pew on the main floor where they would normally sit. And when the white pastor began to pray, a white trustee grabbed a hold of the Reverend Absalom Jones and said, 'You must get up. You must not kneel here.' Jones admonished the man and said, 'Wait until the prayer is over.' The white trustee insisted and said, 'No, you must get up now or I will call for aid and force you away.' Again, Absalom Jones said, 'Wait until the prayer is over.' With that, white officials moved in and they banished the African Americans to the segregated balconies. But right after the prayer was finished, all the black members walked out of the church entirely. In response to this event, Allen said that the white people in that church were no longer plagued with them. Again, this has been called the Black Exodus at the St. George's walkout. Then in March 1793, Richard Allen awoke before dawn, said a prayer, and then went to dig the foundation of an African church. Allen himself wrote, As I was the first proposer of the African church, I put the first spade in the ground to dig a cellar for the church. This was the first African church or meeting house that was erected in the United States of America. This foundation made way for St. Thomas's African Episcopal Church, located on 5th between Walnut and Locust Street. His good friend Absalom Jones accepted the offer to lead this church. Allen would come to head Bethel African Methodist Episcopal Church, which would rise just a few blocks away. An official dedication of the First African Methodist Episcopal Church occurred on July 29, 1794. On this special occasion, Francis Asbury himself offered the opening sermon. Within a year, Allen had attracted over 100 congregants. By Allen's death in 1831, the AME Church had exploded in membership, claiming over 3,000 parishioners in Philadelphia alone. Allen, by the time he was in his 30s, had become a very eligible bachelor. And that is when his first wife, Flora, comes into view. Flora was a former slave who had moved to Philadelphia and started attending Methodist class meetings, and she shared this same vision that Richard Allen had of creating a strong and independent free black church. The couple married on October 1790, and Flora joined her husband in prayer at class meetings, Sunday services, and engaged in benevolent events within the black community. Sadly, on March 11, 1801, Flora Allen died after a 9-month illness. Richard went on to marry a woman named Sarah Bass that same year. Sarah, like Flora Allen, had been a slave. She was born in Virginia in 1764, attained her freedom, and moved to Philadelphia. She also attended Methodist class meetings. She attended services at St. George's and was a founding member of Bethel Church as well. Because of her work in the church and in the community, she became known by many black Methodists as Mother Allen. She was known for opening her home to the friendless, the homeless, and the penniless fugitives. She was even known to help female preachers like Jarena Lee speak publicly in the black church. Another amazing thing about Sarah was that she and Richard operated a station on the Underground Railroad for fugitive slaves starting in 1797, and that continued until they passed away. Richard Allen was doing extraordinary work in leading this new independent black church. He was partnering with Absalom Jones and working with different folks from the church as well. And he even took out loans and sought out the help of white abolitionists. But all of that work came crashing to a halt when an epidemic hit. In the late summer of 1793, Allen saw Philadelphia being gripped by the worst fever outbreak ever. People fled the city. Infected homes were barricaded, and by mid-September, one man said terror now became universal. All of the abolitionist work came to a grinding halt as well, and the yellow fever epidemic was deemed a public health crisis. During this time, Richard Allen and Absalom Jones solicited the help of the black community to help fight this epidemic. They believed that black aid to white citizens would help the cause of racial justice. Black aid workers would go around and visit hundreds of white yellow fever victims and their families. Allen, Jones, and their assistants visited roughly 20 families per day. But then Richard Allen himself contracted this disease in late September. Interestingly enough, Alexander Hamilton, one of the founding fathers, had also contracted yellow fever, and his home was only just a few blocks away from Richard Allen's house. Hamilton was able to recover with the help of a personal at-home nurse, but Allen was admitted to Bush Hill Hospital in Philadelphia, and he stayed from September 29th until November 20th. So he was in the hospital for nearly 2 months. And while he was dealing with this, he experienced headaches, chills, sharp pains in his chest, which was often followed by an upset stomach. In addition, he also experienced hysteria and lunacy. Allen miraculously survived. His neighborhood was ravaged by the disease. Nearly 55 residents died by the end of the year. And black residents were particularly susceptible to this disease because they had a lack of money and resources. Much like COVID-19, They had problems knowing the cause of the disease and how it spread. They didn't know all the details at the time. It's kind of like now we're figuring things out as we go. But it wasn't until later that they found that this disease spread through mosquitoes. At that time, people believed it spread through polluted fogs. So they fought yellow fever by clearing the air. And the way they thought that you had to clear the air was by like smoking cigars, which is kind of crazy. But even crazier, this inadvertently worked because the cigar smoke would actually deter the mosquitoes that caused the disease in the first place. But in the end, the final numbers of the 1793 epidemic reached around 4,000 to 5,000 people. Despite the amazing and incredible work that the black community did during this time, this epidemic also became a vector of racial fears. As the fever got worse, black people became more and more indispensable, and racial fears escalated. If something was stolen from a house, white citizens would blame the black community. White citizens argued that black nurses were price gouging. In response to these sentiments, and white journalists who were publishing racist propaganda, Richard Allen and Absalom Jones decided to issue their own rebuttal. In 1794, Richard Allen and his colleague Absalom Jones published Allen's first pamphlet entitled A Narrative of the Proceedings of the Black People During the Late Awful Calamity in Philadelphia in the year 1793, and a refutation of some censures thrown upon them in some late publications. A really snappy title. No, actually, long titles like this were pretty standard. But in the pamphlet, they write an important and bold message. They say this: "We have many unprovoked enemies who begrudge us the liberty we enjoy, and are glad to hear of any complaint against our color, be it just or unjust. In consequence of which we are more earnestly endeavoring all in our power to warn, rebuke, and exhort our African friends to keep a conscience void of offense toward God and man, and at the same time would not be backward to interfere when stigmas or impression appear pointed at or attempted against them unjustly, and we are confident we shall stand justified in the sight of the candid and judicious for such conduct." This pamphlet tracked racist accusations that white journalists had published about the black community during the yellow fever pandemic, but it also documented Allen's leadership among the church and the abolitionist community. It represented Allen's reform politics and spoke against slavery and the need for racial justice. At the end of their pamphlet, Richard Allen inserted his own anti-slavery addendum entitled An Address to Those Who Keep Slaves and Approve the Practice. In the addendum, Allen writes, "If you love your children, if you love your country, if you love the God of love, clear your hands from slaves, burden not your children or country with them." Allen continued speaking out and doing the work of an abolitionist, and Allen really saw his role as a black mediator. As Richard Newman says, although not formally involved in politics, Allen envisioned himself as a moral mediator, a black leader who mapped out a moral compass for his fellow Americans on the race issue. So, in recognition of his leadership in preaching, Allen was ordained as the first black Methodist minister by Bishop Francis Asbury in 1799. And unfortunately, as far as white elders were concerned, Allen and the black church was still required to defer to white clerics. Despite this, Allen's church, Bethel, continued to grow and became one of Philadelphia's fastest-growing churches. Not just one of the fastest-growing black churches, but one of the fastest-growing churches overall. By the 1820s, Bethel reached over 200 baptisms annually and could claim that it contributed 8% of Philadelphia's total baptisms. In 1816, Allen united 5 African-American congregations of the Methodist Church in Philadelphia, and together they founded the independent denomination of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, the AME Church, the first fully independent black denomination in the United States. On April 10, 1816, the other ministers elected Allen as their first bishop, and the African Methodist Episcopal Church is the oldest and largest formal institution in Black America. By 1817, Richard and his colleague Jacob Tepsico co-authored the Doctrines and Discipline of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, which helped state the ecclesiastical organization and the theological groundwork of the AME Church. As bishop and leader of this new church, Allen did eventually find challenges. On June 6, 1820, a small group of disaffected parishioners detached themselves from Bethel Church and formed a distinct society and took the name Wesley Church. And this Wesley Church was situated just 90 feet behind Bethel Church. They charged Allen with financial impropriety and moral high-handedness. And the reasons behind this are not entirely clear, but it really all started with a man named Jonathan Tudis, who violated Bethel Church rules and allegedly exposed himself to a woman in a basement and fathered a child with a white woman out of wedlock. And when Allen banished Tudis from the church, he did not go quietly. Instead, he led this revolt against Allen and made all these type of allegations against Allen. Allen made efforts to try to unite Wesley and Bethel Church back together, but unfortunately, the union attempts were unsuccessful. So that's just kind of a bizarre story. I don't really know all of the details on that, but there was another conflict that arose in the church, and that was the debate around African American women's right to preach. And the key figure in this debate was Jarena Lee, a free black woman from New Jersey, who compelled Allen to expand African American women's roles beyond just being a helpmate. Their first meeting did not go well. Allen was completely and absolutely against female preaching. But after a preacher fell silent at Bethel services one day, Lee saw an opportunity, and she jumped up and took over. Allen was in the congregation and was duly impressed, and he became an active supporter of her preaching. In fact, together, Allen and Lee preached at some of the biggest revivals on the Mid-Atlantic circuit. Unfortunately, not everyone agreed with Allen's inclusion of Jarena's preaching, but still, Allen continued to grow the AME Church nationally. Allen formed the AME Connection and expanded beyond Philadelphia to various parts of Maryland, Delaware, New York, Massachusetts, South Carolina, Indiana, and Ohio. The AME Church even reached up into Upper Canada as well. Allen then began to turn his sights to Haitian migrants. Allen began to explore the idea of Haiti becoming a political and religious refuge and an option for both black missionaries and black masses. His vision was never really fully realized, but because of his leadership in the AME Church, it continued to grow and expand. On February 14, 1828, Allen held a birthday party as he had now turned 68 years old. And by this time, Allen's birthday was celebrated as an African American festive day. Richard Allen had become pretty much a celebrity. In his old age, Allen could often be seen walking around Bethel Church with his trusty gold-caped cane, which was bequeathed to him by Absalom Jones. But Allen remained involved in the struggle for social justice even in his old age. One of the things that he did during this time was that he shifted his sights from Haitian migration to Canadian migration. As racial tensions continued to rise in America, Allen considered Canada a place of refuge beyond the United States. Allen was always trying to find a pathway for the black community to find freedom and better treatment. Then on March 26, 1831, Richard Allen passed away at the age of 71, and black Philadelphia stopped in its tracks. Even though he had been ill for a little while, this was still a pretty big shock. At his funeral, one observer remarked, "The immense concourse of people who attended the funeral of this pious patriarch exceeded perhaps anything of the kind witnessed in this country. No other African corpse was even attended to the place of interment in America by so great a number of more sincere mourners." As one man from Ohio remarked, Richard Allen, the greatest pioneer of the AME Church, with a spirit of inspiration, diffused through every part of his physical organization, who felt that God had made of one blood all men to dwell on the face of the earth, and that all men are created free and equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Liberty was his object. Richard Allen led quite a legacy. And today, the AME Church currently has 20 districts, each with its own bishop. 13 are based in the United States, mostly in the South. 7 are based in Africa. The global membership of the AME Church today is around 2.5 million people, and it remains one of the largest Methodist denominations in the world. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Methodical Methodist Podcast. If you have enjoyed this show, I hope you might consider heading on over to iTunes to subscribe, rate, and leave a review of the show. It is very much appreciated. And until next time, stay methodical.